Welcome to another speaker series event brought to you by the Cultural Knowledge Consortium. The CKC is a joint interagency effort of the U.S. government to support the development of sociocultural knowledge and facilitate knowledge exchange across a range of sociocultural communities of interest. Contact information, the CKC blog, discussion forums, and other resources are available on the CKC web portal at ckc.army.mil. You will also find a link to recordings of all speaker series presentations on the CKC YouTube channel. You may submit questions using the chat, question and answer pod in the lower portion of your screen at any time. We'll respond to as many as time allows. Content of this presentation should not be construed as advocacy, nor representing the views of the CKC or the U.S. government. This presentation is unclassified and intended for public release. Enjoy this presentation.
Good morning, everybody. This is Jay Hunt, CKC Operations. I'd like to welcome you to another speaker series event brought to you by the Cultural Knowledge Consortium. Today, our guest is Dr. Colleen McCue. She comes to us from DigitalGlobe Analytics, where she is a Senior Director of Social Science and Quantitative Methods with them. She earned her doctorate in psychology from Dartmouth College and completed a 5-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Medical College of Virginia at the Virginia Commonwealth University. Her areas of expertise include application of data mining and predictive analytics to the analysis of crime and intelligence data, with particular emphasis on deployment strategies, surveillance detection, threat and vulnerability assessment, geospatial predictive analytics, computational modeling, and visualization of human behavior and the behavioral analysis of violent crime. Today, Dr. McCue comes to us to present pattern analysis of the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA, and internally displaced persons. We welcome all of your questions, and at any time you can enter your questions in the chat pod at the lower portion of your screen. So, at this time, I'd like to welcome and turn the presentation over to Dr. Colleen McCue. Ma'am, the floor is yours. Enjoy.
Thank you, Jay. Welcome, everybody. It's good to be here this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. What I'm going to talk about today is the use of geospatial predictive analytics to model the Lord's Resistance Army in support of information-based approaches to prevention, thwarting, mitigation, and response. However, the working title for this talk could be, what can we learn about fighting Joseph Kony and the LRA from Walmart and the adult beverage aisle? And I think by the time we get done, you'll see how commercial analytics can be very valuable in our work in the sociocultural environment. The key question with all of this is why just count incidents, whether you're looking at crime, terrorism, extremist behavior, attacks on villages, when you can anticipate and respond more effectively. And the responding more effectively can include prevention, thwarting, mitigation, and consequent management. What we do here is we take predictive analytics developed generally for use in the commercial sector, and we allow decision makers to use this modeling in support of information-based tactics, strategy, policy decisions, especially in the operational environment. And again, the whole goal here is to be able to proactively identify and characterize these trends and patterns so that we can influence outcomes. And just a quick primer on predictive analytics for those that don't work in this space on a regular basis. There are 2 features of predictive analytics that we're particularly interested in: confirmation and discovery. The confirmation piece of it is operationalization and extension of what we know or what we think we know, and being able to create actionable models based on institutional knowledge and memory, and then maybe push those out a little bit at the edges. The second piece, though, which it can be really exciting and invaluable in the operational setting, is discovery, and that's identifying new and especially actionable insight. And if we look to Walmart, we can get a great model of the confirmation and discovery pieces of this, and this goes back to what people have referred to as the Walmart emergency response model. And Walmart is a true analytic competitor. They use predictive analytics on a daily basis to inform their operations. And one of the things that they found through looking at historical point of sale data, so what you're purchasing at the checkout counter, they found that when a major storm, whether it's a hurricane or a winter storm or floods, whatnot, are coming into an area, the purchasing behavior changes, and people generally buy duct tape, bottled water, and strawberry Pop-Tarts. And as we look at that, the duct tape and the bottled water make a lot of sense. We know that DHS and FEMA and the American Red Cross all encourage us to go out and make sure we have enough potable water. The duct tape, I'm a little unclear about what that's for, although I've got 5 kids and I've gone through a couple of hurricanes with them, so I've got some of my own ideas about that. But the real outlier here are the strawberry Pop-Tarts. We can speculate, we can talk about they're yummy, they're non-perishable, you don't necessarily have to cook them, but the bottom line is it doesn't matter. Understanding that there is increased purchasing of strawberry Pop-Tarts in advance of a weather event that's likely to keep people indoors, possibly without electricity for several days, is sufficient for Walmart to adjust their supply chain and make sure that their stores are well stocked with the Pop-Tarts. So again, the duct tape and the water are confirmation of things we know or think we know, and then the strawberry Pop-Tarts is new, surprising, it's a discovery, but it's also actionable. And extending this a little bit back to national security and public safety, we can also think of these strawberry Pop-Tarts as what have been described as the anticipatory black swans. And those are the difficult but not impossible to anticipate. So again, it reduces the uncertainty in our environment a little bit and helps us to get in front of events and perhaps influence outcomes. So drilling down a little bit further, what we're really looking for here is when, where, and what to expect. And the whole goal here is that we want to be able to optimize our scarce resources when and where they're needed. In other words, this would be risk-based deployment or just-in-time deployment of humanitarian personnel, security assets, hardening, resources, whatever it is we need to get out there. Ideally, we'll be able to get in front of it. We'll be able to prevent bad things from happening. We'll be able to change outcomes for the people in the community. If that doesn't happen, though, we'll at least have pre-positioned our assets in support of responding more rapidly and perhaps mitigating the consequences. As we look at the LRA as an example, it also gives us the ability to start prioritizing within the problem space. So for example, we know with the LRA, they engage in looting, kidnapping, murder, and a variety of bad behavior in the tri-border region of Africa. Being able to further segment, better characterize, and understand when those behaviors occur, under what circumstances and where, we can also start to prioritize or even triage. So if we want to say looting is bad, but kidnapping and murder are worse, being able to better characterize the problem space helps us better prioritize our response and allocate our resources. We also know that it can inform our decisions regarding tactics and strategy. You know, again, responding to looting incidents is very different to creating an environment where kidnapping is less likely or will have better outcomes. And it's also important for us to remember, unlike the commercial segment where people are buying a lot of things on a regular basis, we're modeling infrequent or rare events. And while this is a really good thing for our victims, it represents a unique challenge for the analyst and the operator alike. So being able to model these rare events is challenging from a math perspective, and then also operationally, being able to constrain the search space to only deploy resources when and where they're likely to be needed can be a real challenge. Being able to address that, though, really helps us optimize increasingly rare resources. We're also looking at incomplete and unreliable data. LRA attacks, something that folks working in this problem space are aware of, are unreported in many cases, underreported. The information coming in oftentimes is incomplete and unreliable. We know that victims are frightened, witnesses are confused, people are coerced and threatened, and bad guys lie. So understanding the challenges associated with our data can be really important to creating good analytic products. Again, looking back to the commercial setting, though, what we're trying to do is find that word problem that's embedded in the behavior. And also, often when we're working in the operational setting, there generally is no science for science sake. Again, we're trying to turn knowledge into practice. The analytic products really need to be operationally relevant and actionable. We want to characterize and better understand the behavior so we can anticipate it and influence. Again, looking at our strawberry Pop-Tarts example, as a behavioral scientist, I may be very interested in understanding, why that's so preferred and all those types of things. But from an operational perspective, we really don't need to know all the details of it. We just need to know that it happens in order to influence. And that a lot of that goes back also to operations research. We're looking for that 80% solution frequently. And the whole goals of this are to anticipate, prevent, thwart, respond more effectively, manage the consequences, and change outcomes. The use case that I've selected to talk about today is pattern analysis of the Large Resistance Army. It's and the relationship to internally displaced people. And it's a problem that we've been working on almost 3 years at this point, which longevity is probably not nearly as long as many of the people on this call, but it's an area where we've had a fair amount of experience and have good data resources. So just scoping out the problem space, we are looking at the tri-border region of Africa, which includes the Central African Republic, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we originally started working in this space in the spring of 2011. During the course of our first analysis, South Sudan broke off and became a country, and then there were also U.S. and African security forces sent to the region in the fall of 2011, which in some ways represented a natural experiment for us and enabled us to test the models that we had created in a unique way. And also point out that the data that we're using are from ACLED. Those are the incident data that you see depicted on the map. Quick overview of our methods. We use a tool called Signature Analyst. Came out of work that we were doing originally in Iraq and then Afghanistan to anticipate IEDs and identify bomb-making factories, weapons caches, and other areas of interest to the military. And this goes back to the concept that behavior is relatively homogeneous and predictable. So basically what we're modeling are place preferences. And in the case of bad behavior, what the bad guys are looking for is access to targets and or victims, so locations where they can find some density of that, and then enabling environments where they believe the factors will support their ability to perpetrate whatever type of action that they're engaging in. And again, we can look over to the commercial sector. The adult beverage aisle is actually a great example of this. People in the marketing world understand that people move through and interact with their environment in a very predictable and homogeneous manner. And one of the things that they do is aggressively compete for specific, what they know to be preferred locations within the adult beverage aisle to position their products, make sure that they're going to be preferred and that people will interact with them in a favorable way. And you'll also see them putting potato chips and popcorn to, again, precipitate additional behaviors that are all associated together. So we're basically doing a very similar location-based modeling to what is done in the commercial sector, except in this case, rather than adult beverages, we're looking for potential targets and victims, and then again, the enabling environment that will allow them to successfully go after, to forage for the type of targets that they're looking for. It's important to point out too that these behaviors may be conscious or unconscious, and we really focus on the behavior. We very much want to let the potential target of interest reveal their intentions. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about, if I'm Joseph Kony, why am I picking this group over the other group? Why is this location important to me? It really gets the analyst out of the bad guy's head. And because of this, it's also referred to as a supervised learning algorithm, requires known incidents, and then we incorporate geospatial data in its native form as the predictive variables. What we do with the model is we statistically characterize the known incident data, and we're looking both for what makes these incidents similar to each other and what makes them different from everything else. And then we can apply this out to novel space, and this is a unique attribute of this particular approach, is we don't have to find things that are physically contiguous or touching areas of known incidents. We can go well outside the location of the original incident and identify new events, which helps us not only anticipate future events, but also be able to anticipate displacement. And again, when you put security forces into a region or you somehow alter the environment, we often expect the behavior to displace. We're able to effectively model that. And then finally, we can find hidden patterns. So you have the incidents that you know about and those that you don't. We can address both of those. And again, the importance of being able to identify these non-contiguous locations can't be understated, because we know that bad behavior, or behavior in general, tends to jump around. They'll go to the next favorable location, and it doesn't necessarily have to be directly adjacent. And this oftentimes, if we are just counting and reporting and responding, we can end up chasing the problem around an area almost like a bubble under the carpet. This helps us identify the next favorable location that includes access to targets or victims and this enabling environment so that we can get in front of it. And then finally, we can identify correlated factors to better understand and potentially influence the outcome. So if we can see that concealment and privacy and standoff from security factors is reliably correlated with behavior, that gives us some insight and opportunity to influence outcomes. And ideally, this is going to help us better understand what's happening. We can reduce the search space. We can better allocate and optimize our resources. We can influence behavior and outcomes. And operationally, it generates relevant and actionable data. We're giving it to the end user, and we're saying, go here now and expect this. And again, they can set their tactics and strategy accordingly and allocate their resources. So this is one of the first examples of an analytic product that we were able to generate. And these are all of the LRA, the model for LRA attacks writ large within this tri-border region. And what it generally reflects, so as we look at this, the more intense the color, the more deep the brown, the more suitable that environment, or the more likely the attack. We've also highlighted the IDP camps at that time to illustrate that very much these attacks are associated with the locations of IDP camps, which reflects access to victims and targets. It also gives them enabling locations. You can see in terms of the unimproved roads, they are looking for a little bit of standoff, some distance from the security forces, so that they can have the time and space to engage in this behavior. And again, this is not surprising looking back at U.S. criminal history. Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, when he was asked why did he rob banks, he said, because that's where the money is. Similarly, why does Coney and the LRA go after IDP camps? Well, that's where the potential victims, porters, and provisions are located. As we look at this, though, and I touched on this earlier, not all incidents are created equal. We know that kidnapping and murder have greater consequences than looting to the victims. We also know that from an operational perspective for the LRA, kidnapping is more challenging. The requirements associated with acquiring, managing, and moving hostages are not trivial, and likely those operational requirements play some role or have some influence over the target selection and the location selection. Similarly, these different patterns of bad behavior also have different operational requirements that are associated with the different types of attacks. So moving forward, one of the things that we did is we reached back to work that the FBI has been doing for decades at this point on the behavioral analysis of violent crime, and decided to segment the different LRA attacks based on the nature of the behavior. Again, very similar to the marketing community, to the commercial community, and even if you think about cell phone marketing, the advertising campaigns, the different packages that are offered are very different whether you're marketing to young people, to college students, to families, to senior citizens. Going in and further segmenting the problem space oftentimes gives you a more homogeneous data set, and then also enables you to get a more homogeneous and complete understanding of the behavior in support of specifically targeted responses. And One of the things and I will reach back to basic social science research, one of the things that was particularly interesting to us was, I'll cut to the chase, and segmenting based on the FBI outline schema worked like a champ. It turned out that these different categories had some relevance as we looked at the LRA attack behavior, and it's absolutely fascinating from a basic science perspective to know that the concepts and methodology that had been developed on serial killers like Ed Gein and Ted Bundy and the Son of Sam that had been used going forward on Gacy and Dahmer, and even more recently the DC sniper, also had relevance when we looked at Coney and the LRA and other extremist groups, which I'll touch on towards the end. And again, this goes back to behavior can be relatively homogeneous and predictable if viewed in the same light, and that there do appear to be some underlying concepts when we look at violent and predatory behavior, regardless of culture, social norms, local statutes, rule of law, that there are some aspects of predatory behavior that transcend time, space, geography, culture, and legal requirements. So looking at the chart, we broke out the different incident types, and again thinking not only of the different operational requirements for the LRA, but also the different consequences for the victims and how this might enable specific targeted information-based response. Looting, pretty much self-explanatory. The kidnapping is still a relatively heterogeneous group, and at some point would merit some additional segmentation. Embedded within this are kidnapping where people are used as porters to carry out the materials that are being looted from villages. Human shields are also in here, forcible conscripts, and then female sex slaves. Incidental homicide is a homicide that was committed secondary to the commission of another act. And generally this occurred when someone, frequently an adult, was resisting either the looting or the abduction, and they were killed in the process. And then finally, murder was the only mutually exclusive category, and when we segmented it out, and we know generally that violence can be used to enforce social rules and norms and regulate behavior, particularly in an illegal enforcement scenario. So we pulled this out as a secondary, as a separate category. And again, the behavioral segmentation here is operationally relevant and actionable. It links back not only to the operational response that we would want to mount, the security enhancements, the protections, and the consequence management, but it also links back to the operational requirements and primary and secondary gain for the offender. So looting and quick raids versus hostage taking and the management that's required with that, very different operationally for them. Looking at the looting chart, one of the first things that came up was that there's a market offset between the LRA activity writ large and the looting, suggesting that this pattern is separate and discrete and does play out differently than the LRA attacks writ large. So segmenting does make sense and is supported as an analytic approach to looking at the LRA behavior. The second piece that came up in this is the association with the abduction areas. And again, this is consistent with the use of hostages as porters to carry the material out of the region. As we look at the abduction chart, again, we see that there's an offset from the total behavior. This is also slightly different from the looting behavior that we saw previously, and we've put the IDP camp locations on here, again indicating that they are looking for access to targets, and unfortunately IDP camps end up being a target-rich environment. They are looking for some areas where they have the time to go in and access the victim population, and then also the ability to move them and do what they need to do. Also, one of the things, reaching back again, I mentioned that there is some heterogeneity within the sample. Dr. Wayne Lord at the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crimes has done extensive research on abduction crimes, and has shown that victim attributes, including gender, age, and other demographic variables, are related to motives. And again, we are seeing some indicators of this with the LRA behavior, and this would be additional research that would merit study, especially as looking at protective factors and what increases risk and is associated with favorable outcomes. Here are the data, the results for the areas associated with the incidental homicide, again, separate and distinct, and also you are starting to see, again, something of an offset associated with the other individual patterns of behavior. And then the other thing to note in this is that the distance from the murders. So again, this indicates that the incidental homicides and the murders are coming out as very separate, very different, almost diametrically opposed patterns of bad behavior perpetrated by Coney and the LRA. So we begin to understand that these are separate and distinct patterns of behavior, and that this segmentation is has some value to it. And then finally, looking at the murders, we see, again, distance from the incidental homicides. And the other thing that we start to see here is, as we look at where they're located in terms of the total LRA behavior, as we look down into the DRC, South Sudan, and CAR, these murders are actually showing up on the edges, with the exception of the big blob in the middle. They're showing up at the edges of where the LRA activity is occurring. And one of the things that we know is that violence can be used to regulate behavior, of course, social rules and norms. And this is especially true when you have some tension between legal and illegal enforcement networks. In some ways, behaviorally, this is a very good way to establish boundaries of the LRA activities. It's almost the behavioral version of cutting off heads and putting them on pike holes on the perimeter, establishing a no-fly zone. And again, important implications for being able to allocate resources, keep people safe, and better understanding what else might be going on behind the behavior. So extending this outward somewhat, we know that the LRA is not the only group operating in this part of the world. And one of the other things that we did as we started looking at this, as I mentioned, in the middle of the original work on the LRA, there were resources put into the tri-border region to address the LRA and Al-Shabaab at the time. And one of the things that we saw very quickly was the LRA and Al-Shabaab as groups were very different. We saw very quick and obvious differences in target selection, recruitment, the way they operated. And putting in a common response to such disparate groups, to us, there would be some challenges operationally in that. So moving forward, we took the original model that we used for the LRA and did a comparison and contrast based on the behavioral attributes to Boko Haram, which is another group that's been challenging, and Al-Shabaab. And we know that these groups are very separate and unique in many ways, and have their own histories, objectives, their MO, create ungoverned and undergoverned spaces that create additional problems for the communities in these areas, and then their ability to engage in create a climate of fear in the areas that they operate. And again, looking over Nigeria would be the area of interest for Boko Haram. In this tri-border region, we have the LRA, and then Somalia and leaning into Kenya, we have Al-Shabaab. Part of the comparison and contrast that we did behaviorally was we knew right off the top that there were differences in the victim selection. This is a very busy slide with a lot of details in it, but some of the general trends and patterns that emerged were that all three groups looked at soft targets as ideal platforms, and the LRA tended to be unique in this area where they had erratic and brutal behavior that generally made all populations vulnerable. Anything that was in their reach was potentially of interest. Boko Haram and Shabaab tended to be a little bit more targeted. Specifically, Boko Haram primarily targeted government security forces, Christians particularly worshiping in church, which is something unfortunately over the weekend and today has become a topic of discussion again. Shabab, they tended to target three different groups: those who posed a direct threat to their organization, which included security forces, the KDF, and other military threats. The second group were groups who they saw as being obtrusive and perhaps interfering with their local operations, including local officials. And then again, as events over the weekend underscore, they also conduct operations as part of a larger information campaign targeting both domestic and international targets against civilian soft targets. And one of the outcomes on this is that it really underscores the official government, the rule of law, ability to protect people locally. And then finally, the LRA, anything and everything. When we first started this study, we were not, the LRA was focusing largely on IDPs. Since we have been looking at them, they have had some activity up in southern Car where they've attacked Western extractive interests and those type, the French uranium mining camp. Now they're getting into poaching, so they seem to be relatively indiscreet in terms of what they go after. The next slide looks at the recruitment. Again, there are some big differences there. All groups lean on some of the disenfranchised populations, particularly young males who I had the privilege of seeing the Somali president speak last Friday, and he spoke repeatedly of the large population of young men with no hope, no skills, no training, and at a very depressed look at their outlook and access to opportunity. We see this in the U.S. You know, these types of populations are particularly vulnerable to recruiting, being able to join groups, especially if there's the promise of resources being given to them or their families. The LRA has used forced conscription a lot in the past, and then they also have an indoctrination process which involves having young people in particular kill family members, neighbors, whatnot. And again, this is a very psychologically intense way to pull someone into the group and create cohesiveness through these common bonds. And then finally, Shabab, they are interesting and particularly troubling in their ability to go into IDP camps and refugee camps and aggressively recruit with attractive messaging, but they also have a very sophisticated Western-facing recruitment effort through their Twitter campaign, which has been active through the Nairobi incident. They're also very good at collecting donations, getting people to come over for training from the U.S. People have shown up from Kansas City, Minneapolis, San Diego, throughout the U.S. There is concern and active tracking of this group and the relationship to the international recruitment efforts. And then finally, looking at shared TTPs or MO, we see that all of these groups are operating in regions that have overwhelming problems with disease, food insecurity, lack of access to clean water, poor governance or lack thereof, political exclusion, and creating generally an environment where these alternatives are perceived as being attractive. Again, they're able to effectively exploit porous borders, weak security, and the inability of the government to effectively protect the people living in these regions. The general choice of targets tends to be a little more noteworthy. The LRA, again, goes after small and remote populations. They try to avoid direct engagement with security forces, whereas Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab will engage if they believe that there is advantage and they're going after soft targets. The LRA tends to use small arms, light weaponry. Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab tend to use more complex asymmetric type attacks such as IEDs and suicide bombers. One of the final areas that we've been looking at with regard to this, particularly as relates to Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, is some sort of mechanism for these shared TTPs or MO. For example, is there a common affiliation? Is there an Al-Qaeda core that they're reaching back to understand how to execute attacks successfully, what works, what doesn't? We have seen Boko Haram originally, several years ago, had these complex attacks, starting to see more of those in the Horn of Africa being perpetrated by Shabaab. So the question is there a common source of training? The other avenue for sharing information are extremist forums and other mediums, social learning. Again, if they see something works particularly well, we know that Shabaab is much more media savvy in the way they use social media. Could be convergent evolution. Again, the fact that we're seeing common predatory behavior across culture, geography, time, rule of law does suggest that there are certain patterns of violent and predatory behavior that are common and transcend these divisions or coincidence. So those are areas from a social science research perspective that we're continuing to research to better understand how these groups evolve over time, what sort of interaction, if any, and then what the implications would be to better understand and influence the outcomes in favor of the people living in these regions. So as we wrap up this section, wrap up the talk, again, reinforcing the idea that reporting, collecting, and compiling data are necessary but not sufficient. We need good data that's likely to come from collaboration and groups like CKC and some of the collaborative efforts that have come out of this, but just collecting the data sets the stage for the analysis, but the analysis is key. Also, looking outside of our own training and confines for novel approaches. Being able to look to the marketing community and say, well, gosh, they're looking at foraging behavior, which is very similar or can be similar to predatory behavior. What can we learn? How can we segment? How can we analyze it? Are there specific algorithms and math that we can apply to it? Are there different data resources? Looking to these other groups, especially as we start dealing with big data, there are other people that have gone ahead of us that have developed some techniques that work. Being able to leverage those in support of our own efforts can be really helpful. The key, though, is to emphasize good analytic process, always letting the process, the question, drive the analysis. We want to keep away from, I have a link analysis package and my agency spent a lot of money for it, so everything that we look at is going to be a link analysis problem. Turning instead to saying, what is the question I'm looking at? What is the embedded word problem? What is the best analytic strategy for this? And if I don't have it, who does, and how can I integrate it? And being able to be flexible from a process perspective enables us to be fluid and responsive and readily adopt new capabilities, tradecraft, and data resources as they're developed and made available to me. Geospatial, for me, is a real winner. It enables me to convey complex analytic output in an environment that allows the end user to not only interpret and use the findings, but also incorporate their tacit knowledge and domain expertise to extend from it. This supports the development of novel insight and innovative solutions. I can take some very complicated statistical output, convey it in a geospatial environment, and an end user who maybe is not has the ability to handle the math can look at the map and say, I need to go here now and expect this, and oh, by the way, I can understand by where this is located on the map that these are some other things going on, so I'm adding to the analysis. That is a great thing when it happens, and that creates a truly exciting environment for the type of transdisciplinary collaboration that groups like CKC, the HSCB program at the DoD, and some of the other programs where we're all coming together with our unique skill sets, tradecraft, attributes, data resources, and coming up with these novel disruptive solutions that can be truly game-changing for the people that are struggling in these parts of the world. And that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great, and thank you to Dr. Colleen McCue. And while our audience is preparing the questions and typing them in the chat box down below, I have a couple questions of my own. And I also wanted to clarify one from Karen Owen here. There was a little bit confusion early on when you spoke of the sourcing of incident data. She
Yes.
said that it sounded something like ACLED or something like that. Can you clarify that just a bit?
Absolutely. That's ACLED, A-C-L-E-D, and it stands for Armed Conflict Event. I think it's data, but if you go into a search engine and type ACLED and then Armed Conflict Event or Location Event, it will come up. It's a group, Clint O'Reilly, Dr. Clint O'Reilly in Ireland has compiled it, and it's not global, but we found it to be an incredibly rich resource. Also for the LRA, we did a fair amount of work using the Invisible Children Crisis Tracker data set, which is another really good resource and includes some narrative.
Sure, and thank you for ACLED. Great.
Correct, yeah.
And while I guess I see that they're typing already, go ahead and complete your questions there. One quick one is, I like that this seems to map out the conflicts pretty nicely and does quite a bit of predictive analysis on it, and it works well in the cases that you've shown with the LRA and Boko Haram. What about other areas of conflict, particularly those that are emerging, that we don't have quite, it hasn't gone hot yet? Like, what are the precursors that you've been able to identify?
That's a really good question, and one of the driving themes behind doing this work in Africa, particularly as we started getting into the comparison and contrast between the different groups, was creating a model that leveraged good social science, behavioral research that could be applied to new environments. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the analytic techniques were originally developed for use with counter ID. We've since applied it domestically to crime analysis, but the underlying behavioral concepts are that behavior is relatively homogeneous and can be predicted. So using this type of modeling approach to model victim and target selection and place preferences as it relates to these enabling environments can be applied anywhere. And again, they're using it to place the adult beverages in your grocery store. We're using it to look at armed robberies, aggravated assaults, IED emplacement, HME locations, weapons caches, and where Kony and Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram will be operating. So it really underscores CKC and the HSCB programs that bringing these behavioral models and applying them as a framework helps us hit the ground running for understanding bad behavior, where it occurs, regardless of the groups that are involved. And one final thing with that also is that finding that the FBI behavioral analysis of violent crimes concepts and schema works so effectively against the LRA really does underscore this idea that there are some foundation level behaviors that we can go past some of the superficial attributes of these crimes, look for the underlying behavior, and get a leg up on modeling, understanding, and influencing very early on.
Sure. And so where else in, Dr. Claire Mattel writes in and says, what other areas of Africa and the world have you and your team done such analyses on?
Well, we, other than the three extremist groups that I talked about today, we've also done work, actually globally. We've done work in Central and South America. We're using these types of models to model violent crime within the U.S. Obviously, we're up in Afghanistan, Iraq, locations like that. And then as different hotspots are emerging, we're jumping in and again applying the lessons learned to say what is unique about these groups, what is similar, what have we done in the past that worked, what is going to require new solutions and be different. so that the operational end user has a more informed perspective on what they're responding to.
Great. Let me take a different task. Carl Prinzel writes in and has a question about, is murder on the edges indicative of not being LRA activity? I mean, could it actually be other elements doing it independent of the LRA and letting the LRA take the blame for it?
That's a really good question, and that's an occupational hazard with the LRA in particular. Is one of the challenges that we had generally was almost any act of banditry writ large was attributed to the LRA. And that's why we leaned on good data resources like the ACLED database, and then also the Invisible Children Crisis Tracker, which has a really good internal process for validation and vetting, and then they assign actually a reliability estimate to the incident data. So we went with those data resources. But yes, that is an occupational hazard with some of these groups, is it's very difficult in some cases to explicitly attribute, and we tended to go conservatively, if anything.
Sure. And here's a question. This is more about the predictive nature of it. Karen Owen writes in and says, does the model handle error estimation? It's very suitable to model past events and predicting where future similar events may occur, but have there been, or is there a method that you've used to test the accuracy of the prediction?
Yes, there are multiple ways of doing that. One is in the creation of the model, there's an embedded bootstrapping technique that gives you an assessment of how accurate and reliable the model is. And for the end user, we also have the ability to adjust some of the parameters. So if they, for example, want to widen the search space, that will increase the accuracy of the model, but it's also much more resource demanding. Similarly, if they are limited in resources, they are going to have some false negatives within the model, but they do have that ability. The second piece of it is we will almost always, if the data are sufficient, in this case it was, do a split sample approach. So we'll do a training sample and then a validation sample to look at it on a truly novel data set. And then finally, one of the sad things about this type of work is you can often effectively model and anticipate events, but the operational requirements necessary to prevent them sometimes lag a little bit. So we're frequently in a position where we're creating models and events are still happening, and so you do have a prospective ability to validate the models. And in this particular case, as I mentioned with the LRA, we started before the resources were put into the tri-border region, the U.S. and African resources. One of the areas that we identified as being a likely location for future activity was southern CAR. And after those resources were put into the region, we did see some displacement of incidents, heavy incidents, up into southern CAR. So this is yet another way of, unfortunately, prospectively validating the model. And I say unfortunate because almost always in the type of work that we do, it means that something bad has happened to someone.
Indeed, yeah, there are times where you just don't want to be right.
No.
Here's a question, a methodology question, coming from Bridget Hogan. She says, I see how you came up with the categories of events, looting, abductions, etc. Those are all pretty straightforward. How did you come up with the categories within victim selection, recruitment, and shared TTPs?
That was generally more of an open source review, and everything that we did in this example was completely open source without caveats, so that it could be shared freely with partner nations as well as NGO communities operating in the region. That included review of the open source literature and academic reports on these groups and the incidents, and setting up these behavioral categories in terms of things that we knew to be important and likely differentiators between the groups. So that was qualitative and something that we can use going forward as quantitative metrics to create the models, but that was exclusively based on behavioral analysis and understanding the requirements and factors that would be possibly important to victim selection, target selection, and TTP, and then parsing the literature accordingly.
Okay, and these next questions are they're sort of unspoken, and a lot of when you get into the geography and the data part of it, it's all very much numbers and points on a map. One of the concerns that our anthropologist friends have brought up, and rightfully so, about data privacy concerns. The privacy of victim data and other sensitive information, and the question behind the question is really what happens if this information gets into the hands of the bad guys, or they know that we're using it. Would they be able to use these kind of same techniques that you're using to either thwart our efforts or improve theirs?
That's a really good question and a little bit of a complicated answer. First, as we're thinking about the data privacy concerns, which I know has been very, very much an issue locally given some of the recent events, we're asked quite frequently, what about the privacy of victim data and other sensitive information? We are looking exclusively at behavior. There is no place to input personally identifiable information, which from my perspective as a behavioral scientist is the real power behind the solution. People can change, but their behavior tends to be relatively homogeneous and fixed. And we also know that some of our more sophisticated adversaries will actually, if they're engaging, for example, in a coordinated pattern of hostile surveillance, will switch out the observers. They may use different people every time to collect the information. It's the behavior, though, and the review of potential target that tends to be relatively homogeneous. So I see this as a real power that transcend individuals, including series where there are multiple actors. For example, we know that there is an organizational structure within the Lord's Resistance Army, and while there are some individual differences in how the leadership operate, there are some common trends and patterns, so we are able to transcend across those individuals. On the flip side, though, one of the very hot topics right now in crisis and conflict mapping is that we are looking at sensitive data of vulnerable populations. The Ushahidi data set originally came out of election-related violence, or that capability. So it's always important to consider security and victim security in particular at multiple points in the process. For example, as early as the problem statement, we're going to ask this question, play devil's advocate, who could be hurt at the data collection point, the preparation after you get the analysis, am I revealing too much, and then what is the distribution for my output. In terms of this getting into the hands of our adversaries, remember that we're modeling both conscious and unconscious behavior. So not some of the things that are included in the model, the perpetrator may not be consciously aware of. They just may feel comfortable in a certain environment or think that the crime will work in that area. So it's very difficult for them to truly get inside and thwart these types of approaches. And I think one really good example of this comes out of the crime analysis environment where we have staged crimes. And one of the things that we know with people who are trying to stage crime is oftentimes the suspect thinks that he or she knows what normal trends and patterns are, and in an attempt to mimic them, they end up with a crime scene that looks like something that came out of the movie of the week rather than a real crime scene. So in their inability to truly understand what normal trends and patterns are, they oftentimes stand out. And again, the behavior does tend to be relatively homogeneous. So even if they're trying to act good or fly below the radar or conceal their behavior, there are certain foundation level requirements embedded in the activity that they're trying to do that they can't thwart. So going back to Coney, he has to find these victim populations. He has certain preferences that he may or may not be aware of, and there are certain environments that are enabling. That's asking a lot for him to not only intuitively understand what he's doing on a conscious level, unconscious level, and still meet the requirements for perpetrating the crime.
Sure, and thank you for that. The switching gears a little bit to the actual the tool that you used, the Signature Analyst tool. Is this the tool the best one? I mean, is it what other tools were considered for this sort of analysis? Was it just because this was used in Iraq and Afghanistan, so we already had it, or what is it that makes the Signature Analyst special? What's the special sauce of Signature Analyst?
For me, there are two aspects of it. One is the ability to bring in complex geospatial data in their native form. So with other tools, there's a requirement to create spatial sets to somehow roll up and aggregate the data so that the software tool can accommodate it. Related to that is the ability to pull in hundreds or even thousands of geospatial factor layers is a powerful technique. We can create some truly complex models, and we do have the ability to leverage an inductive approach, which enables us to roll it all in and get the model rather than forcing things in based on what we think the bad guy might be doing, which, again, from my experience, that as soon as I try and get into the bad guy's head and say, well, you know, if I was Joe Coney or if I was Jeffrey Dahmer, these would be the things I want to do. In many cases, those folks aren't even aware of what they're doing. So I think we have a much more powerful technique. On the flip side of it, geospatial is game-changing, in my opinion, for the operational environment. Again, you're able to say, go here now and convey and expect this, and we're able to convey very complicated statistical models in an intuitive manner so that the end users can not only understand it, but incorporate what they know about the world and extend from it and execute accordingly. Signature Analyst, from my perspective, is probably the only tool that has this array of features, particularly when it comes to being able to incorporate the data in their native form and truly accommodate that big data resource. Not to understate, though, that having the experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the U.S. now with domestic law enforcement does give us that institutional knowledge and foundation upon which to build. So there is a benefit in that.
Okay, and one last question. It seems that there's a pretty good tie into this predictive, that were the same methodologies that the crime analysts here in the U.S. have used. Was there an effort to look at how this might be used for predicting the precursors of larger terrorist type activities?
Yes and no. Again, we require training data. So unfortunately, you know, there's always, can we predict a Mumbai type attack? Can we predict a Nairobi Mall attack? You need to have training data to create the model. So it is an inductive approach, and there are other methods if you don't have the training data. Where we do find that this has a unique benefit is we worked on the Northern Virginia military shooting series, and we're able to successfully anticipate locations where Yonatan Malaku, a self-radicalized lone gunman, selected. Those are the type of series that counterterrorism that we can be particularly effective with, and it's particularly valuable because we are, again, looking at behavior and what does the past behavior say about future behavior, intentions, and actions. And the lone gunman is particularly difficult because, frankly, you can't penetrate a cell of one individual. So using the behavior to create a model to anticipate when and where in support of placing resources, we're also able to incorporate some geospatial analysis of a high-profile event with the place preferences, and then use that for things like the Marine Corps Marathon, Veterans Day. So unfortunately, that's become particularly relevant recently, given the Boston Marathon shooting and then upcoming events.
Sure, and thank you for that. So we're at the end of our time. Do you have a closing thought? What's the big takeaway that we can take away from this presentation?
I think the big takeaway are two things. One is to look outside your own domain. These transdisciplinary approaches can be game-changing. The marketing community is very good at this. They understand the operational tempo and requirements. We can learn a lot from them. The second piece of it is the behavioral analysis, pulling in culture, understanding of social characteristics, and good social science research, theory, and practice really plays a significant role in not only better characterizing this problem space, but helping us influence outcomes and change outcomes for the communities that we serve.